Welcome to An Honorable Profession, a podcast giving America hope since 2018. I'm Ryan Coonerty. Along with Debbie Cox Bultan of the New Deal, I'm lucky enough to be your co-host. An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. The New Deal is an organization that supports the next generation of American leaders. From attorneys generals to state senators to mayors to school board members, these are the people that are pushing policies and politics that will respond to climate change, rebuild our economy, address racial injustice, and restore our democracy. These are incredibly talented people who have dedicated themselves to public service when their country and their communities needed it the most. Check out newdealleaders.org to see what I'm talking about.
In today's episode of our limited series, How Government Can Get Shit Done, I'm joined by Jim Townsend. Jim's a former member of the Michigan legislature and a New Deal alum, and for the past 6 years, he served as director for the Levin Center of Oversight and Democracy, housed at Wayne State Law School. Named for former U.S. Senator Carl Levin, the center promotes fact-based legislative oversight as a key to the integrity, transparency, and accountability of government. Jim and I talk about the false choice between defending institutions that aren't working and tearing government to the ground, and how DOGE and the current political climate might create an opportunity to remake government that's more responsive and effective. We talk about President George Washington's reaction to the very first congressional oversight hearing, about the specific tools at lawmakers' disposal, and questions policymakers should be asking to ensure that legislation is actually delivering results for their constituents. I hope you enjoy this very special episode about the critical role that state and local leaders in particular can play in rethinking how we do approach public policy design and oversight to help restore faith in government. All right, Jim Townsend, welcome to An Honorable Profession.
Well, Debbie, it's great to be with you and see you. I'm just thrilled to be part of this. Thank you for asking me.
Of course. I'm so happy. As I said in my intro, it's, we've known each other a long time. You were an original New Dealer, but I'm very excited to have you here in your capacity as running the Levin Center and to talk about this really important issue of oversight. As our listeners will know, that this is a part of a series we're doing on how government can get shit done. And I think it's so important. I feel like sometimes we talk a lot about, laws that are passed, how we implement them, and then sometimes miss the part where we go back and we figure out what's working and not working. And so, I know that your friend and my friend Jen Palka was on our show recently talking a lot about kind of the barriers to implementation and the disconnect between, thinking about passing a law, but then actually how's the work going to get done, and that we focus too much on just getting stuff passed, not near enough conversations about, what are the barriers, or sometimes there's laws passed on top of each other that contradict each other, all these things of just being more mindful about, how we can actually get to deliver results for those things that were passed. And to me, your work, which is so great at the Levin Center, and I'm grateful for your time here, is on this piece about figuring out what is working and what's not working, right? Is about and having politicians or elected officials, lawmakers, hold themselves and hold the implementers, hold everyone accountable for delivering the results that were the intention of the law in the first place. So I'd just love to, have you start maybe a little bit with just talking about, for people taking this kind of giant step backwards at the beginning, like, what is oversight? What does it mean? And what does good oversight look like?
So oversight can occur. Well, obviously, the word oversight is a little bit misleading because it's a very broad term that can apply in lots of circumstances. I mean, it can be somebody looking over your shoulder. Right. It can be a lot of different things. It can be a mistake. Obviously, an oversight. There's all kinds of ways it can get confusing. But to make it sort of simple, oversight is just communication. Oversight is really people in government communicating with either other people in government about what a public policy is doing, or perhaps people outside of government who are affected by that policy, exchanging information and monitoring whether that policy is working, whether there are problems potentially with the policy, sometimes fraud or corruption, or just simple mismanagement, or maybe the policy is just fundamentally wrong. And The Supreme Court, oversight is a power that, of course, we expect to be exercised by both the executive and the legislative branch. Administrative oversight, which would be management in government, say the executive branch, overseeing the work that it's been charged with doing by the legislative branch. But the framers of the Constitution had in mind that, yes, there would be distinct separate powers for the executive and legislative and judicial branches, but that there was a good deal of overlap. In other words, you can't pass a bill without the executive signing that into law. Likewise, you have to have the legislative branch involved with overseeing and monitoring what the executive branch is then doing with that authority that it's been given, the money that Congress has appropriated. So it's really about communication and overseeing and then communicating with the public about what is happening. So that's fundamentally the way we see it. The Supreme Court, in a series of landmark cases going back about 100 years, has written about the power of oversight and its fundamental element. It's being a fundamental element in the work of the legislative branch.
We're going to get to the talk about where we are as a country, where there's a lot to talk about is in the oversight in this current climate. But I was prepping for this and I was reading an article, I think, or an interview you just gave. By the way, happy 10th anniversary, I think, to the Levin Center last month. So congratulations on that huge milestone. But you were talking about the very first congressional oversight hearing in that interview that you did. And I thought that was fascinating, right? Can you just tell our listeners what the very first congressional oversight was about when George Washington was president, correct?
That's correct. In 1792, there was a failed military campaign in what is now Ohio, or roughly Western Pennsylvania and Ohio, is then the Ohio Territory. And a coalition of native nations defeated the U.S. military in a battle. And the people were up in arms about this because they thought that our military would be able to pacify the area. And they failed miserably. And so Congress wanted to know what went wrong. But at that point, there was no precedent for the executive branch, the president, or his appointees cooperating with an investigation. Oversight is not in the Constitution explicitly; it's an implied power. So that first investigation only occurred the way it did because President Washington, to his great credit, directed his generals and the other people in the administration involved with this campaign to turn over documents, to appear at hearings, and to fully cooperate with what Congress was asking. And that set the pattern for this relationship between the legislative branch and the executive branch and the oversight that has occurred ever since.
Isn't that amazing? It's like it is just that decision, right? That we're all going to play by these rules, that we're all going to operate in good faith, and that we're going to come together to try to solve problems. That is so heartening and yet so frustrating right now, given the political climate that we find ourselves in, right? I mean, and I wonder, when people think of, maybe not people listening here, because we've got a lot of people who follow government, but I think when maybe people who don't think about oversight, they think about some of these really performative hearings they see on TV in Congress, which is really about scoring political points. It's not really about holding people accountable, or maybe it's about holding people accountable, but certainly not about finding answers and finding a path forward together, right? It's really about gotcha a little bit. And so I guess I wonder what your take is right now on, and we'll get to the work you're doing in the states in a second, but while we're staying in Congress for a minute, what your take is on how we can get back to, or whether there are bright spots we're not seeing on TV in Congress where people are operating, doing oversight in kind of a more constructive way. Well,
there are. Well, I'll start with your second question. There are some bright spots, but not nearly enough bright spots, and there are fewer than there were in the past. We give an award to lawmakers at either the federal or state level for doing excellent oversight. It's the Carl Levin Effective Oversight Award. And just back in December, we gave the award to John Ossoff, the senator, U.S. senator from Georgia, for his bipartisan investigation into the U.S. prison system, the Bureau of Prisons. to a multi-year investigation that he did in cooperation with Republicans to get to the bottom of a whole bunch of problems in our federal prison system that led to a report, extensive findings and recommendations that were then turned into a legislation that passed unanimously. So, these were big reforms about a very challenging issue, and the issue of corrections and crime, that's not always been an issue that Democrats and Republicans have seen the same way. But that's part of the point, is that when you do work across the aisle and put facts before party, put country before party, and work on the facts, you're not going to change each other's philosophy, but you do have an opportunity to get to the bottom of a core issue and reach an understanding on some key facts that can then provide a sort of a foundation for potential compromise. And that's what people forget, that our system is really based on compromise. The framers created these competing co-equal branches of government, a federal system where sovereign states operate within this larger federal system. And so there are a lot of people who can veto. There are a lot of veto points in the system, and that's by design. And so the design is that we are supposed to be able to work together and compromise. And what we've not been seeing enough of, now for years and years, is a belief that compromise is something that's desirable.
Yeah. And what about this point about, your example about George Washington directing folks to cooperate, right? I mean, we have the opposite now, right? People, if the other party is calling you to testify at a committee hearing, you refuse to come, right? I mean, you just flat out say, this is a witch hunt, we're not going to participate. I mean, so how do we move forward in that environment? Is there anything that can be done to be able to get to those facts, and to get to those, the transparency that is inherent in everything we're talking about? Actually, this is really about transparency, right?
It's very difficult. I would say this, that, and this is something that Ezra Klein, maybe a month ago, wrote in a great column he had. We've got kind of two unacceptable and competing and unacceptable versions of governance that are prevailing right now. One is sort of on the liberal progressive side, which defends government, at every turn, and isn't really engaging with the failings of government, and isn't really being open enough to really trying to reconstruct government. And then the other side wants to tear government down and destroy the institutions of government. And neither one of those is acceptable. And they are a product of the polarization that we are experiencing. So I don't have a sort of a magic bullet as to how to offer, how to get us out of this box we're in, except to say that a better way, a more viable alternative has to be based on a recognition that one government is legitimate and essential to our to our success as a society, and to our standard of living, and to our everything that we sort of take for granted, and that government isn't doing nearly enough to serve people effectively. So we have to have those two things in place. And I think, as dark as these times are, and as much as I am deeply disturbed by the lawlessness that we're seeing from the Trump administration, these kinds of times can be an opportunity for fundamental reform. And I think, it's incumbent upon people like us who are trying to map a different direction, not to give up, but to be even more committed and to believe. It's easy, say, with Congress, to give up on Congress, right? Congress is not, it's abdicating its fundamental powers. And so why talk about oversight? They're not even exercising the power of the purse effectively.
Right.
But that's a mistake, because the only way forward, think about what the people in the progressive era did at a time when, the country careened from, incredible periods of growth and then huge depressions. every 5-10 years. The 19th century was a train wreck when it came to people's daily lives and the economy. And progressives really started challenging that and offered different approaches to governance that took hold. And we have the 20th century, the success of our government and everything that we then inherited in the 20th century and now the 21st century really as a result of that. So I think, we have to seize this crisis as best we can and try to insist that government do better. And I think that's the way forward. And you've got to offer an alternative. You just can't say they're wrong.
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree with you on lots of points you just made in that answer, including the fact that we do have an opportunity as Democrats who believe that government has an important role to play in our society, to recognize this moment for what it is, which is a pretty big repudiation by a majority of or maybe a cry for a statement from Americans saying this is not working for me, and to hear that loud and clear and to do something about it and to not defend institutions that are not working and to be willing to make change and to make government work so that it delivers more for people, of course, while resisting with in all ways we can, this lawless approach and this cruel, frankly, and haphazard approach to just kind of torching the whole place and not really worrying about who that hurts or what that's going to actually do in terms of making government work. I think that there's I don't think there's a plan here to make it more efficient. I think there's a plan to burn it down. But to your point, let's talk a little bit about some of the work you're doing in the states, because you have turned you don't only work with Congress, you work with folks in the states, and there is there are opportunities while we are in these dark times to push forward and make progress in states and localities, and to in part in response to what's happening in the federal government, but also just in general. So I'm, obviously a lot of our listeners are state and local elected officials or people who work for them or people who aspire to be them. And I would love for your thoughts on thinking about if you're on a city council or in a state legislature, what are some of the things you tell lawmakers to think about when they think about whether they're on a committee that has oversight jurisdiction, or whether they're thinking about a new piece of legislation, or the ways to think about oversight from the beginning? How should lawmakers think about oversight at the state and local level?
Well, I think the place to start is actually something that really connects with the New Deal, because what you've created is this amazing network of state and local elected officials. And what we find, we have worked with Congress for years and with state legislatures for quite a while. But in the last couple of years, we've started to work with local governments, with large cities. And what we found is that the closer you are to implementation, which is really city government, local government, the more, this is common sense, the more you're tuned into the realities of implementation. So I think there's much to learn from the experiences of people in local government that can inform how we should be designing policy at the state level and federal level. And it should begin with this notion of how much we know and how much we don't know, I guess. We need to focus on what people are actually experiencing with government, the capacities that are on the ground and in place, what we know, those things, and then what we don't know is are exactly what something's going to cost, exactly how implementation is going to roll out. I think this is a powerful point. Jen Paulka makes this point quite compellingly, and there are some other people making this point, I think, quite well too, and that is that budgets and estimates are only that, estimates. And when you're in local government, you get that because you realize that you see the full picture of what it is to roll out and actually serve the public. Mm-hmm. And so the more we can take advantage of our federal system, frankly, and listen to people at the local level and test out how things really roll out and occur, the better off we're going to be in terms of trying to make government much more effective and efficient. So I think the New Deal, you're almost in a unique position because you're creating these opportunities for people both at the state and local level from different states to share information with each other. And I really think that's a path forward in terms of making the design of public policy much more centered around the people's experience with government, how both the beneficiaries, the people receiving the service, but also the frontline workers who've got to deliver the service, whether they're coding, a website, or they're delivering meals, or serving people in a DMV office or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I appreciate you saying that about NewDEAL. And I think that's right. We have so many fantastic folks who are designing policy at the state and local level, and thinking about this in the front end, I think, is so important. And to that end, you and your colleagues were very gracious to come to our last conference and talk a little bit to leaders about how to think about oversight as they're designing policy. As part of your conversation, I remember you were encouraging people to think about the questions they needed answered. I don't know if that's the way you would say, but to think about it, to think in advance about what questions you're going to want answered, just to be able to determine whether something was successful. And in the spirit of, again, not to point fingers about or to place blame, but to be able to shift resources as necessary, to be able to say, okay, we tried that and that's not working, let's try it a different way. So when you're thinking about designing this policy, what are some of the questions you would encourage people to have in mind that they're going to want to be able to understand on the back end?
Right. So I think the first thing to do, and it's the reason I like to focus on the insights you get from local government, is that at local government, you don't have the same sort of separation of powers phenomenon. I mean, obviously there is a difference between the city council and the mayor's office, but they tend to be much more connected and able to partner with each other. So that's really important, because it gets you over this kind of excuse that lawmakers tend to have, which is like, okay, we've written the law and we've appropriated the money, now it's your turn. Mm-hmm. And you check out a little bit, you move on to the next thing. And what we train people to do at the Levin Center is to think of it much more in a cyclical way. I mean, if I had a whiteboard behind me, I'd be showing you a cycle, and essentially policymaking and problem solving really is what the business we should be in, is much more iterative. You try things, you assess the situation first and gather information through, the preliminary stages of oversight. And then maybe you do need a new rule or a new law, but before you move forward with that, you do a thorough examination of what the system has now and what it can absorb, and what new requirement, what a new requirement would actually do to the system you've already got. And that's where we don't have nearly enough attention paid. It's so easy to just draft a bunch of bills. In a lot of legislatures, they call it the bill mill. That's how they view the legislature. And most of the resources in legislatures are given over to drafting legislation. They have a lot of talented attorneys and analysts who draft these bills, a fraction of which ever become law. Why can't they, and this is what we advocate for, is shift some of those resources toward analyzing and working with the executive branch to better understand the system that we're all operating in, so that, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? If you're a lawmaker, everything looks like a statute, like you've got to draft a statute to solve a problem. And I think over the years of my experience working in Congress and serving in the state legislature in oversight roles, I've gotten out of that thinking. And now I think that the way to approach this has got to be much more systemic. How is the system working? How well can we understand it? We have data tools at our disposal now that people could only dream of, even 10 years ago, let alone, 50 or 100 years ago. So we have a lot of tools at our disposal, and AI can be a really important opportunity for us if we decide to use it. And people are starting to experiment with it. So there's a lot there. But those are the fundamental questions: is what is the system? How is it operating? And the other thing we very much emphasize is, when you're asking questions, make them open-ended. A lot of lawmakers, again, you've got a pet idea, you've got a bill or an agenda, and you want to push that through. And so you do oversight in service of that agenda. That's not really the right way to go about it. If you want to solve a problem, it's best to suspend your assumptions a bit and ask open-ended questions that are basically the following: what do we not know now that if we did know, we could really make progress on this issue? And if you're open, then you tend not to go down, blind alleys that lead nowhere. We always cite this example. Senator Levin, when he was serving, got very concerned about oil spills in the Great Lakes. His constituents were coming forward and telling him about these oil spills. And a lot of people assumed, well, because of, high profile accidents that have occurred with oil tankers, they said, well, we've got to crack down on the shipping and the industry that ships oil through the Great Lakes. Luckily, Senator Levin and his staff didn't narrow their scope immediately. They asked open-ended questions about how do oil spills occur and where do they occur and how often, and a lot of basic questions like that. And what they found was that 95% of the oil spills have nothing to do with the shipment of oil. They have almost everything to do with the way oil is handled at ports, at the facilities where the exchange is going on. So the focus needed to be very much on changing the way those facilities operated. So that's just an example of an open-ended question that gets you in the right mind frame and moves you in the right direction versus one where you could spend years wasting a lot of time and taxpayer money solving a problem that doesn't exist.
Yeah, that's such a smart example. And I love that because it's actually demonstrates the point that this is not only on the back end of after legislation is passed, right? And then you go back to, to think about whether the legislation you pass is doing what you said it was going to do. That example is almost about before we even write the law, before we even think about what the right statute is to address a problem, do we understand the problem well enough? And are there other things on the books that are not being implemented well enough that we should actually be going back to before we pass another law, right? Or whatever that is. I think that's really smart. You had a couple examples that you brought to NewDEAL, the conference. Do you have another maybe current example at the state or local level that you're watching as a really good model that people can draw from?
Gosh, I mean, there's so many kind of good examples where states have recognized a problem and really pulled together resources to do good fact finding on the problem, and then really made progress. So, and there's never that example I just mentioned about Senator Ossoff. Now that's the federal example, but a couple of years before that, or the year before that, we gave the award to Senator Ron Wyden and Charles Grassley for their work on the organ donation system, right? Mm-hmm. Which is a very problematic system. Actually, this is the system whereby those of us who are unfortunate enough to need an organ transplant rely on the system to gain access to available organs. And there were huge problems with that. And they did a deep dive, did a really good investigation, and led to some reforms. But those reforms are only as good as the follow-up that has to be done. And that's kind of the fundamental message here, is that oversight is never over.
Yeah.
That it is a cycle. And so you have to keep going after these challenges and keep learning. So, there's so many good examples. I would cite in Connecticut, not long ago, but over some period of years, they really went after their juvenile justice system. They had some 10 or 15 years ago, some of the highest rates of youth incarceration in the country. And they became really concerned about it. And they the legislature appointed a special panel to do a deep dive investigation into that problem. And it led to a whole series of reforms. And their statistics have improved dramatically in the last 4 or 5 years as a result of that work. So I cite that as just one of quite a few examples that we've seen where state lawmakers and local officials have the great privilege of really being close to these problems and the access to information that comes right from their constituents, right from the public officials that they work closely with all the time. When you're in Washington, or even in the state capitol, it's harder, but certainly in Washington, it's harder to be able to make those connections and gather that information. So I think part of the way forward here is to look to the work that state and local leaders are doing to learn, and then to be really, quite honest about what they're finding. The main one thing I'm always asking is, why can't people who are more on the more liberal side be just as interested in getting rid of a regulation, getting rid of sort of the the accreted, it's sort of the sludge of regulations and rules that have built up over 2 centuries now. If you really believe government can make a difference, you've got to also believe that there are a lot of things that we were enacted 50 or 75 years ago, or even 15 years ago, that might not have been right, or we may no longer need. And yet that's not enough of the conversation these days.
Yeah, that's right. But I totally agree with that. And although I'd like to say, and this came up in the conversation I had with Jen Polka too, the frustration I have right now around this whole conversation, which essentially is taking place through the lens of DOGE, of course, is everything you just said is absolutely right, of course. And yet some of it is being painted as some kind of nefarious, this whole effort. Everyone should want to get rid of waste, fraud, and abuse. I think that, what more, I don't think that's near the numbers in terms of savings that they think that they're going to say based on those buckets. But there are lots of places, if we were doing this in a good faith way, where you could say, look, that made sense at the time, but that's no longer serving us. Let's get rid of it. But it's this kind of demonization of government. It's the demonization of bureaucrats that is so frustrating, but I hope, I want to, and, lead us down a dark road again, but it's hard not to sometimes, but to really be clear on what we're trying to do, which is to improve government, not demonize government, right?
Absolutely. And I think this, the DOGE, we've published a blog post about what's going on around the country in various states that are doing things they're calling DOGE. Right. And, there's a lot of activity going on around the states under that moniker, but there aren't a lot of savings being identified so far. And what we'd like to do, and what we're advocating for instead, is what we call proactive oversight, which is to help states and local governments prepare for, what I'm calling the tsunami that is possibly going to come in the form of a federal government that is pulling out of a lot of things that it has been involved in for decades.
Yes.
And who's going to pick up the pieces? Are states prepared for this big change and pick the issue? Education, the environment, clean water, health, yeah. Nutrition. Obviously the biggest one is health and Medicaid. So we're not, we don't, as an organization, take a position on whether changes at the federal government are a good thing or a bad thing. I have my personal views about that, but what we do as an organization, and what we're going to be doing more of, is trying to equip states with tools to help them proactively assess their capacity to deal with this change in all these areas. And that should be a message that Democrats and Republicans at the local and state level should be willing to engage, because they are the ones who are going to be left holding the bag, sort of, with whatever comes out of the federal government.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And one other point I want to make, just listening to this and having this conversation, is I also think you kind of pointed to this earlier, but I think we need to think about the messaging in the politics of this too, right? I mean, to your earlier point about kind of the build mill, is that what you called it? Of essentially, too often, I think, people measure success. Like, how do you measure success, right? That's always what it comes down to. So if you're measuring success by how many bills did I introduce, or, how many things could I carry for different constituents or whatever, that kind of misses the mark on delivering results, right? And so I would love to see a shift. And I think that that's super important, because I actually think, as a side note to this is all tied to the health of our democracy, right? If people don't believe their government is delivering, people are going to be skeptical about democracy. And so I think that we've got to, particularly again, as a party who's, believes government has a role to play, has to have a special obligation to make it work well. And so, I think this focusing, turning our attention to, but also messaging around what results we are delivering, how are we making people's lives better on the ground through government, as opposed to what happened on the front end, the outputs, not the inputs, if you will, is really important as well.
Absolutely. And I think this is where, a new orientation that's toward problem solving and not just passing bills, that is toward really engaging constituents, groups, but also individual constituents. We have the data to do this now. It's a question of whether you can really build more systems to really learn from what your constituents are telling you on a broad basis. But yeah, being connected, and I mean, if you were really connected to your constituents, you know that just passing that legislation isn't really solving the problem. Solving the problem is following up year after year, quite frankly, and making sure, and maybe making adjustments to the law. That's something that, other countries have more tools to do that than we have in terms of ways to adjust legislation. But we have tools as well if we use them. Administrative rules. A lot of states have a lot of capacity to engage their administrative rule process, which is what follows legislation, and they don't use it nearly enough. So there's many ways. But I think serving constituents and thinking about your constituents. I mean, that's any lawmaker I ever worked with, served with. What they enjoyed most was talking with their constituents, helping solve their problems. I mean, if there was ever the moment when you really enjoyed the job, it was when you helped somebody with a problem they were having with the government. So that's the orientation we should be encouraging. And I think the New Deal, through your unique connection between state and local, you've got a lot of ways to help us all learn how to do that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Let me end with a final question, which is we like to ask here because it is we share this passion for making government work better. Clearly, what led you into this? You of course started in elective office. You worked in for elected officials, that became an elected official. Now you're back running this amazing center and working with elected officials all over the country on oversight and transparency. So what drives you? What got you into this business in the first place, and what keeps you going?
I've always been somebody who sort of asked why, why are things the way they are? I grew up in the Northeast in the New York City area, and I saw the circumstances of people people who were lucky and people who were not very lucky. And I was always driven to sort of try to get to the bottom of why that is and what can be done about it. And so I started my career in government, in politics and government, and I worked in Congress, but I left that for a big chunk to go into the private sector, and I've worked in the private sector in addition to serving in legislative office, and I don't think anybody's got a fix or a necessary. Nobody has a sort of a panacea or a way to fix all of our problems all by themselves. There's a lot we can learn from what the private sector does, and I think this focus on the experience people have with government is one thing that the private sector kind of teaches us, which is no business that stays in business forgets about its customers. And even though government is a very different enterprise, and I don't buy into that. You run government like a business, totally, but you can be informed about. You can learn a lot from the orientation of serving your customers, or in this case your constituents, in that same way, and really insisting as a lawmaker, say that you yourself think that way, but also that the laws you pass and the administrative agencies that you're charged with overseeing, that you work with them to give them the resources, but challenge them also to be as informed about those end users, those people at the end of the line who are the ultimate reason for government, that their experience is positive. And if that's the way you're thinking, then I think you can make government work. You can make democracy work. And so I saw a lot of things not work. You and I are kind of the same age. I mean, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and a lot of things I lived in New York City for a while, urban areas, things were not working very well. I lived in Washington, D.C. in the 80s and 90s. Wow. Washington, D.C. was really struggling at that point. And so I've seen a lot of things struggle to work, even though a lot of people will tell you everything, we're passing these big programs and we're making things work. And I always thought, gosh, I'm not so sure. I think we have to do a better job. Mm-hmm. And it starts with listening to the people and understanding how they're experiencing government.
Yeah, I love that. Well, thank you, Jim. It's always good to see you, and I really appreciate the work you and your colleagues are doing at the Levin Center. I think it's super important, and we're very proud to be partnering with you on this and trying to help make government more transparent, more accountable, and more effective. So, thank you.
Debbie, thank you. And I look forward to lots of opportunities in the future to learn from so many of your leaders who are at the state and local level, who have so much to teach all of us about how to make government work.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim.
An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. Thanks to the team at NewDEAL for producing this episode. We encourage you to bring honor to public service, and because we keep things honorable, no tax dollars are used in the making of this podcast.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.